Kari McCracken. I'm a faculty member here at St. Ed's and I teach in the honors program. Welcome to our 250 presentation with Kendall Laudenschlager. Okay, I taught her as a freshman, you would think I would know after all these years. Her presentation this afternoon is 50 Shades Phenomenon, Masculinity in Contemporary Romance Novels. Turn it over to Kendall.
Well, thank you everyone for coming to my honors thesis presentation. I wanted to start off with a little bit about why I chose the path that I did. I'm a double major in social work and English literature, and when I tell people that, I get a whole lot of confused looks, and sometimes I even get the question of, how are those disciplines connected? What's the connection? I don't get it. For me, the connection has always been that they really do influence each other. You know, literature grows from society. It's a product of the societies that we create, and in turn it does have that ability to influence and to change those societies as well. So I wanted to create a thesis that demonstrated how this can happen. So I decided to take the literary aspect of the Byronic hero in contemporary romance novels, and I wanted to combine it with the sociological concept of toxic masculinity. And in combining this, I came up with the question of, how do depictions of male characters in contemporary romance novels affect both male and female perceptions of themselves, as well as of the opposite gender? So in order to do this, I analyzed 3 novels for 3 key plot points. I analyzed the first meeting between the hero and the heroine, conflict rising between them, as well as the final stance of the book, how everything is wrapped up, and whether or not they get their happy ending. I also had a main focus on female reader responses, and so how they responded to the hero and how they responded to the heroine. So starting it off right with toxic masculinity, I chose a George Orwell quote that says he wears a mask and his face grows to fit it. This is a new, often misunderstood concept within our society, and I think there's a lot of misplaced angst around what toxic masculinity is. So I wanted to clarify what it means in the terms of this thesis and how ideally it should be thought about. So this is where the quote comes into play, because with toxic masculinity, it demands that men mask parts of themselves in order to fit masculine norms and in order to fit into society with what we think of as ideal masculinity. So I wanted to also point out that toxic masculinity begins by being harmful to men, because it hurts them. I guess I would say it hurts them on the inside, right? Because it demands that they belittle or deny parts of themselves that we deem feminine, but those are natural parts of themselves that they're forced to shove down, right? And so then, because they're forced to shove these things down, it then extends to harmful or toxic behavior towards other people. So, many social work researchers describe toxic masculinity as basically a rejection of the feminine. So as I was looking through this, I really started to wonder, you know, as these male characters in romance novels interact with their female counterparts, how does toxic masculinity come into play in romantic interaction? So moving right along into what the Byronic hero in contemporary romance is, I picked a quote by Mr. Christian Grey from 50 Shades of Grey, who says, "I want you, and the thought of anyone else having you is a knife twisting in my dark soul." Right, so this is the peak Byronic hero type. You have that very angsty kind of expression. They are very psychologically tortured. A lot of people would think of them as kind of the anti-hero or the bad boy of literature. And when it comes to contact with romance, it does have this idea of a consuming love. They do really fiercely love the heroines that they interact with, and this can either become good or bad, right, depending on how that romance is written and how that's depicted. And it is of note too that the original Byronic hero came directly from Lord Byron's poetry, and he was not created for a happy ending. He was the ultimate anti-hero, and he was ultimately made for destruction. But as this comes more into contact with romance, right, that formula has to change because the romance is created for that happy ending. So for the most part, our Byronic heroes in romance do get that happy ending. Now looking at the male characters that I analyzed, the quote by Dr. Attar Stein comes to mind, when she says that Byronic heroes have dark hair, heavy eyebrows, and an almost perpetually grim expression. So you can see, like, all of these guys are physically attractive. They do have those grim expressions that make us believe that they're hurting in their hearts, you know, and they do, for some reason, have heavy eyebrows. I don't know what the correlation is, but it's definitely true. So the big here is that even though these men are psychologically tortured, they can at times be cruel in different ways, and they are very mysterious. They are ultimately lovable and redeemable as characters, and this is what makes them so compatible with the romance genre, because they are redeemable. Because ultimately, whether you're reading fiction or you're living your own lives, nobody can contemplate living the rest of your life with an a-hole, right? So they have to be redeemed. So putting this up more simplistically, on the left, you have the defining traits of toxic masculinity and the defining traits of Byronic hero on the right. Now, as you can see, not all of them are directly relatable. For instance, while violence in toxic masculinity and the violent and aggressive nature of the Byronic hero is directly relatable, but I found it really interesting to kind of mix and match these different traits to see how some might influence each other. So for instance, if you take the stoicism that we associate with toxic masculinity, it can maybe correlate to the isolation that we find in a Byronic hero. Or if you take even bigger, the lack of vulnerability that is accompanied with toxic masculinity, you can translate that to arrogant or controlling behavior on the part of the Byronic hero. Alright, so we're talking about the first meeting in all of the 3 books that I analyzed. I picked another quote by Christian Grey. He's full of them. And he says, I want you, I've wanted you since you first fell into my office, and I know you want me. Now I picked this quote because it really is par for the course on the idea that this first meeting is very based in physicality. It's very based in that instinct and instant attraction. It's what sells readers. It's what sucks us into their story. And it's where we decide ultimately if this is a romance novel that we believe and that we want to read. Now, because there is this focus on the physical, it means that there's an automatic shift in language. And we find that that language becomes centered on the male body. So in a study that analyzed 703 romances, for the language they used in accordance to how highly those books were rated, they found that the top #1 word, which would indicate that a novel is highly rated, is an anatomical word that rhymes with suck, right? That's the #1 word that determines if a novel is going to be one that women want to read. So what does this mean? Well, it's kind of natural, right? Because most of these novels are from the female perspective, so it makes sense that that gaze would be focused on the male. However, it does create really high expectations right away for how men should look and what that ideal masculine body is. So then, stepping right into the conflict rising part of all the novels I read, I picked another quote from another of the books that I read where the heroine says that the hero, great, a vampire with the social equivalent of road rage. And this is true in some way of all the heroes that I read. You know, they do have a tendency to be insensitive or cruel at times. They do at least have the idea to use violence to solve some of their problems, even when they don't actively use violence. But mostly what I noted is that they do have a pronounced lack of emotion and lack of vulnerability as they continue interacting with those heroines. And the heroine doesn't like that, right? So we come to find that these male behaviors that they start to exhibit more of in the novels really do seem to conform to traditional masculine values. So the relationship begins to suffer because they start to conform to hegemonic masculinity, or what we think of as ideal masculinity in this society. And so the heroine starts to realize that these behaviors aren't conducive to effective or beneficial relationships. Because if we think of toxic masculinity as a rejection of the feminine, when you're interacting romantically with the feminine is not going to really like that, right? So there's a negative response there. And finally, we get to my favorite part of all romance novels, the ending. I picked a quote by Lord Byron himself to honor the Byronic hero, and it says, "Love will find a way through paths where wolves fear to prey." And this is ultimately true, no matter the story, no matter the background, no matter the behavior of the Byronic hero. It's true in all of the stories I read, and this is ultimately because of that element that he has of being lovable and redeemable. So they get this happy ending. Why? They get the happy ending directly and specifically because the male chooses to release most toxic behaviors that she doesn't like. He chooses to connect, and sometimes this means he learns to cry, he learns to communicate, he learns to be open, and he releases that, and so they're able to have that happy ending. But it is of note that masculine behaviors are going to be kept by that man, they're going to be retained if the female finds them attractive. So an instance of this would be, in this society we tend to romanticize kind of behaviors on the male's part of control or jealousy, and we tend to think that those are positive indicators of a relationship. And so those behaviors might be retained if the female actually wants those behaviors. Also of note, in 50 Shades of Grey, even though they ultimately do get their happy ending over the trilogy, she leaves him decidedly in the beginning of the first book, specifically because he refuses to release those negative behaviors, and specifically because he is still on some level rejecting her and clinging to that toxic masculinity. So then we get to the female reader response and what this all means. And I chose a quote by my favorite social worker of all time, Brene Brown, who says, "You either walk inside the story and own it, or you stand outside the story and hustle for your worthiness." And this is really where the rubber meets the road, right? Because it's where the novel affects reality. Because we do respond to what we read. We always have some sort of a response, even if it's negative or positive. So similarly, female responses to these novels do have both positive and negative indications. And what really stood out to me as I was doing this research was the importance of being in your own story and living your own story, because we all joke about how real boyfriends can't compare to book boyfriends. And that's true, because novels are controlled. They're meant for that happy ending, and we don't always have that control in real life. So it's important to draw the line between fiction and reality. So up here I just have some quotes from some researchers that I'm going to go ahead and summarize for y'all. The big idea here is that we are able to use novels to reflect on our own life and our own society. We use them as a framework to understand. So the positive side of this is that when female readers read heroines who cultivate good relationships and have really good boundaries and good communication skills, it means that the readers are more likely to emulate that in their real lives, and they're more likely to say, I want to be independent, I want to be spunky, and I want to be intelligent. So this correlates to females rating books better that do have those strong and independent heroines. However, on the negative side, these romances can teach us to romanticize negative behaviors, as I was saying before, such as anger or control, as signs of love and commitment in a relationship. And to an extent, it can also perpetuate sexism, such as the idea that the woman should be cherished or that the woman is fragile, or even in some instances that the woman should give up her own needs for the sake of the relationship. So we come to the conclusion. I picked a quote by Mr. Orson Welles, who says, if you want a happy ending, it depends, of course, on where you stop your story. Here's where I stopped my story. I stopped on how romances influence reality for both men and women. And I stopped here because it seems most prevalent for what I want to do with my career and how I want to make my mark on the world. However, this barely scratches the surface of all the things that can be done and all the research that can be performed on this. So there's always more to do. I have by far not done it all. So, my findings. I quickly found out that complicated questions lend themselves to complicated answers, right? So there are positive and negative indications for men and women. I talked about that a little bit. But we find that the female positives are that they do have an increased positive identification with the heroine, so they start to relate more to positive traits and good relationship building, great skills for women to have. And they also have a model of positive behaviors for what partner interaction should look like, what it looks like when you're teaching someone to communicate or to have boundaries. But then the female negatives are that there is still some amount of expectation in place for males to act in a given way, and there is still that normalization of poor behaviors, such as, like I was saying, with control and jealousy and anger. And underneath that is kind of the idea that the male's toxicity might change if the woman would only love him enough, or if the man loves her enough to change, but that's not always true. There's kind of this idea that it might be the woman's job to fix a man. But even though toxic behavior translates to happy endings in romance novels, sometimes it just translates to intimate partner violence in reality. So that's also where it's really important to draw that line between fiction and reality. So on the other side, we have the male pros. There are less expectations from females to act in a toxic way, so there's less pressure for them to behave that way, which is nice. And they also are given a positive model of what reformed behavior looks like from a male, what a non-toxic behavior and what a non-toxic dialogue looks like, so that's nice. But on the male negatives, there are still some behaviors, as I said, expected, such as having that perfect body and having that control in a relationship. And even though less pressure might come from women to act in a toxic way, there is still a constant low level of threat from other men to act in a way that conforms to toxic masculinity. So that concludes my presentation. I did want to give a really quick but very heartfelt shout out to my thesis advisor, Dr. Barbara Philippides, who was so dedicated and so patient and giving, and I could not have done it without her. And also to Dr. Adam McCormick, who helps me with all of my masculinity stuff and helped me not mess it up. So I could not have done it without either of them, but Dr. Philippides was my shining light. And then these are just some key references. By all means, they're not all of my references that I used, but they're the most accessible ones for anyone who might be interested.
Questions for Lauren?
Great presentation, by the way. So, if toxic masculinity is the rejection of the feminine, can you define the feminine?
Yeah, so it's kind of difficult, right? Because there's a lot of research out there that says that that masculinity, our idea of masculinity is basically hollow, right? There's no one definition. It's basically you have to keep repeating these actions, and that's what confirms your masculinity, such as playing sports or clapping each other on the back. You know, like there's certain things that we think of as masculine, but generally we tend to associate the feminine with nurturing behaviors, connecting behaviors, emotionality, crying, things like that. And that's ultimately where it comes into play, is that lack of connection in romance novels, because even when you do get into the head of some of these male characters, they're like, oh man, like I don't want to like show that I'm a wussy or whatever to this woman. So then he's like, well, I don't think you're that great. And like, why don't you just make me a sandwich? And then she's like, how dare you, sir? You know, so like, so even though men naturally might like want to nurture, and they might feel like crying, they might be criers just as much as some women are, they don't feel comfortable doing that because they're not allowed to, and they're not allowed to feel pain or upset. So they have to translate that into anger and belligerence, because that's the only thing that the society accepts. I mean, how many times have we heard, man up, be a man, quit crying? So many times. Why? What is masculinity? I don't think anybody really knows, but we associate the feminine with emotionality, and then we put a negative moniker on it in some ways, I think.
This is a very big question, but still a very good answer. Do these books have value?
Yes. Yes. I think that's a big question too, because I think in this society we have a big problem with escapism. I mean, you can meet a whole bunch of people who are adults who love things like Harry Potter, who love things like romance novels, and they're embarrassed to say that, because we don't value that a book allows us to escape, it allows us to live a different life and explore different worlds. But that's not good enough, because as long as we're not reading a self-help book or reading about how to get rich in this society, we don't think it's valuable. So I think that these novels in a lot of ways do have value, because it allows us to understand what different romantic relationships look like. And as long as we understand that that's not always how it's going to be in reality, it's good for escapism, and it's also good for understanding who we want to be in relation to another person.
In those stories where the men do reform themselves, is there some kind of similarity among kind of what tips the balance for them in these stories, do you think?
Yeah,
and
I
is it
think
the woman who kind of spurs it?
Yeah, I think it's ultimately kind of a threat from the woman, right? It's not that she's intentionally trying to threaten him, but in one, you know, she almost dies, and then he realizes how much he loves her, and he cries over her, and he's like, you can't leave me. I think he says, GD, you can't leave me, right? And he realizes that it's more important for him to express himself than to lose her. In some ways, you know, like in 50 Shades of Grey, she walks out on him and he realizes that he doesn't want to live a life that doesn't have her in that. So if that means changing his behaviors to a more nurturing aspect, then he's going to do that.
Time for one more.
If what gets rid of toxic masculinity is the influence of the woman, is that, could that be really negative in our society, where a lot of issues or violence comes from men with toxic masculinity who feel isolated by women and like can't engage with women, because this perpetuates the fact that they can't get better without the woman that they feel need to be this?
Yeah, I think that's a very good question. I think first and foremost, the idea that it's the woman that changes, novels are utterly controlled. They're like, you can do anything with a novel and have the exact outcome that you want, right? So it's not always going to be true, and that's why it's important to draw that line between novels and reality. But I do think like toxic masculinity starts inside, so that's where we have to start. We have to start learning, what in our society makes us feel like we have to act in a certain way, makes us feel like we have to be in a certain way, regardless of who we're with or who we're around. Like, when you want to cry or when you want to, like, show vulnerability, why don't you? So I think it starts inside, and then it, just like the toxic behavior translates outside, that's what gets translated outside when it becomes benevolent.
I don't think people realized when she took on this project that it would be twice as much work to try to combine the two fields of that. She did a wonderful job. It's been a privilege to walk the journey with her.